Her boss laughed in my face at the dock. My wife barely kissed me goodbye. I just smiled. What neither of them knew was that the quiet man with the car keys had already been moving pieces they couldn't see. By day 2, nothing on that ship would ever be the same. My name is Ronald Hargrove. I'm 56 years old. I spent the better part of my career as CFO for a mid-size industrial firm out of Columbus, Ohio. The kind of company nobody writes magazine profiles about, but that quietly moves product and quietly makes money. I retired early, transitioned into private investing, and by most external measures, life was exactly what a man my age was supposed to want. Nice house in the suburbs, 2 grown sons, a wife with a title, and a calendar full of speaking engagements. We looked like a success story. Gloria was Chief People Officer at Vantage Forward, a leadership development agency run by a man named Todd Fielding. Todd fancied himself a corporate visionary. He had the kind of confidence that fills a room before he does. All loud opinions and louder shirts. I met him twice at company dinners, and both times left the table feeling like I'd been talked at, not talked to. Gloria loved working for him. She called him transformational. I called him a man who'd never been told no often enough. The cruise was his idea. 3 days at sea off the Gulf Coast, what Todd described in the company newsletter as a culture immersion voyage. No press, no shareholders, no oversight. Just key executives, selected staff, and their plus ones. Gloria mentioned in passing one evening over dinner, the same tone she used for dry cleaning pickups and dental appointments. Todd's doing this leadership retreat on a charter ship in April, she said, not looking up from her phone. I'll need to be there. I asked who was invited. She listed 4 names. I recognized 2. The VP of Strategic Partnerships was one of them, Ryan Coulter. 47, polished, the kind of man who always seemed to have just come from somewhere important. I'd seen him at 2 company events. Both times he stood a little too close to Gloria when they talked. I didn't say anything then. I filed it. The morning of the departure, I drove Gloria and 2 colleagues to the marina in Tampa. The sky was clear and the water looked like hammered silver. It was the kind of morning that makes you feel like everything is fine. Todd Fielding was already on the gangway when we pulled up. Hawaiian shirt, drink in hand at 9:40 in the morning, sunglasses pushed up on his forehead like a man who'd declared victory over the workweek before it started. Ryan Coulter was right behind him, laughing at something on his phone. Todd spotted me helping Gloria with her bag and walked over with that particular smile. The one that says I'm being friendly, but we both know I'm not. Ronald, he said, extending a hand. Thanks for the delivery. The 2 women behind Gloria laughed. Gloria adjusted her sunglasses and said nothing. Don't try to stop us, Todd added, louder now, spreading his arms toward the ship like he was presenting it as evidence of something. 3 days, no spreadsheets, no husbands. He laughed at his own joke. Ryan laughed too, right on cue. I looked at Todd Fielding, his drink, his grin, his absolute certainty that the world was arranged for his comfort, and I smiled back. Slow and easy. Wouldn't dream of it, I said. Gloria kissed me on the cheek. Her lips barely made contact. Don't start anything, she murmured, low enough that only I could hear. I'm just saying goodbye, I told her. She held my gaze for 1 second longer than comfortable, then turned and walked up the gangway. Todd said something to Ryan. They both laughed again. The dock crew began coiling lines. I stood there and watched the ship ease away from the pier. My phone buzzed. It was Kyle, my older son, 29, and currently living 40 minutes away in a condo that my money, technically our money, though Gloria handled the transfer, helped furnish. She off. He texted. Just left, I wrote back. Good for her. She needed this. I put the phone in my pocket and walked back to my car. On the passenger seat sat a leather folder, unmarked from the outside. Inside were 41 pages. A preliminary compliance review initiated by the Geneva branch of Ashford Capital Partners, a firm in which I held a controlling interest through a layered trust structure that Gloria had never once asked about. Vantage Forward had been under quiet review for 11 months. The crew's budget alone, cross-referenced against payroll, guest manifests, and reimbursement filings, had raised 14 separate flags. I started the engine and pulled out of the marina lot. Todd Fielding thought he was sailing in open water. He had no idea the floor had already been drawn out from under him. I didn't retire because I was tired. I retired because I was ready for a different kind of work. The kind where no one schedules your Tuesday and no one needs you to present quarterly projections to a room full of people who've already made up their minds. I walked away from the CFO title at 52 with a clean reputation, a solid network, and enough capital to begin building something quieter and considerably more durable. Ashford Capital Partners started as a consulting arrangement, debt restructuring for underperforming mid-market companies. Dry work, the kind Gloria would glaze over after the second sentence. I prefer it that way. Over 4 years, I converted a portion of my compensation into equity positions, built a layered trust structure across 2 domestic entities and 1 registered offshore, and gradually became the kind of investor that doesn't appear in press releases. The companies I touched either stabilized or got absorbed. Either way, someone moved on and someone else moved in. Vantage Forward came onto the radar 11 months ago through a routine portfolio scan. One of our subsidiary analysts flagged it as a candidate for acquisition. A culture consultancy bleeding cash through vanity programming, leadership retreats, and a content division that produced podcasts nobody listened to. On paper, it looked like a tax write-off with a logo. In practice, it was the company that signed Gloria's paychecks. I recused myself from nothing. I disclosed nothing. And I waited. The acquisition closed quietly 6 weeks before the cruise. Our holding structure now controlled 53% of Vantage Forward's voting shares. The board had been restructured through a procedural clause I drafted personally, a provision that allowed for unilateral authority transfer in cases of documented financial misconduct. I called it what it was, a pressure valve. Set it and wait. What I hadn't expected to find, though I should have, was Gloria's name in the audit trail. Our legal team in Geneva had been running a cross-reference for 3 weeks. Guest manifests against payroll, expense filings against internal HR records, reimbursement entries against authorized contractor lists. It was the kind of work that takes time and generates nothing dramatic until suddenly it generates everything at once. The preliminary report landed in my inbox on a Wednesday morning. I read it at my desk with coffee in no particular urgency. The way you read a report you already suspected would say exactly what it said. Gloria's initials appeared in 2 separate entries. One listed her as a consultant under something called an emotional optimization workshop, a line item worth $4,000 billed to the company's discretionary wellness budget. The other tied her to the VP suite reservation, cross-referenced against a guest badge issued under an unverified credential. That badge had been scanned into 3 restricted access areas of the vessel. The scan timestamps were logged. Her photo was attached. I set down my coffee and read the page again. Then I opened a second file, one my attorney had quietly assembled over the past few weeks through standard discovery channels. It contained something I hadn't asked for, but had half expected, a record of a consultation Gloria had with a family law attorney 8 months ago. A single meeting, 90 minutes, billed and logged. The attorney specialized in high-asset divorce proceedings. 8 months ago, for months before the cruise was even announced. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. She hadn't stumbled into this. She'd been planning an exit while I was still driving her to office dinners and refilling the coffee maker every morning like a man who had no idea the house was already for sale. My phone buzzed on the desk. Kyle. Hey, Dad. You doing anything this weekend? Colin's coming down. Thought we could all grab dinner. I typed back. Sound good. Saturday work. Kyle and Colin. 29 and 25. Different in almost every way that mattered. Kyle moved through the world expecting it to accommodate him, and Colin moved through it like he was still figuring out where the edges were. I loved them both the way a father does, which is to say without conditions but not without clarity. Kyle called his mother every few days. Long calls, easy laughs. He and Gloria had that particular closeness that forms between a firstborn and a mother who makes that child feel chosen. I didn't resent it, but I'd noticed, over the past 2 years, that Kyle's condo rent had been quietly supplemented by transfers from our joint account. Transfers I'd seen on statements and said nothing about. For $1,500 a month. Month after month. I did the math now, sitting at my desk with the audit report open in front of me. 30 months. $135,000. Give or take. Gloria hadn't mentioned it once. I closed the laptop, picked up my coffee, and walked to the window. The yard was still, the morning light flat and even. Somewhere out on the Gulf, a ship was sailing with my wife on board, and a CEO who thought he was untouchable and a VP who stood a little too close to things that didn't belong to him. I thought about the board clause sitting inside Vantage Forward's amended bylaws like a loaded question nobody had thought to ask yet. Then I went back to my desk and sent 2 emails. The first was to Walter Crane. The second was to Geneva. I've worked with numbers long enough to know that the most dangerous documents aren't the ones full of obvious errors. Those get caught. The dangerous ones are the ones that look almost right. The ones where someone moved money carefully, changed a name here, adjusted a date there, and counted on nobody having the patience to follow the thread all the way to the end. The Geneva team had the patience. The full compliance report arrived at 11:43 on the second night of the cruise. 37 pages, tabbed and indexed, with a 12-page executive summary that I read first and twice. The lead auditor's name was Philip Okafor, a compact, methodical man who had spent 20 years in international financial oversight before I brought him onto the Ashford team. Philip did not dramatize. He stated, that was why I trusted him. The report laid it out in sequence. Vantage Forward's cruise budget had been coded under 4 separate departmental accounts to avoid triggering the internal review threshold that applied to single-line expenditures over $25,000. Split 4 ways, each entry looked routine. Together, they represented $118,000 in unauthorized corporate spending. No board approval. No external vendor contracts, no legitimate business purpose that aligned with the company's stated quarterly objectives. The guest manifest had been altered. Philip's team had recovered the original version from a backup server. 11 names appeared on the amended list that had not been on the original, including Ryan Coulter, whose presence had been reclassified from personal guest to contracted consultant after the booking closed. And Gloria. Her entry listed her as an organizational wellness advisor, a title she did not hold and a contract that did not exist. At 11:58, I forwarded the report to Walter Crane with a single line. Section G is active. Your discretion. Walter was already in the air. I knew him from a board appointment 3 years earlier. A man in his early 60s who wore expensive watches and said very little in public settings. He didn't have a social media profile. His assistant screened every call. He had the particular stillness of someone who had seen enough corporate theater to find it genuinely boring. When I called him 2 days before the cruise and explained the situation in full, he listened without interrupting and then said, "Tell me when and where." That was the entire conversation. At 2:16 in the morning, the Ashford board convened digitally. 7 members, 2 in pajamas, 1 at a family event in Phoenix, 1 logging in from a car. Nobody complained. The numbers had a way of making location irrelevant. The vote on Section G, the clause permitting emergency authority transfer in documented cases of executive financial misconduct, passed unanimously at 2:49. Walter Crane was formally installed as interim chairman. His transport had been arranged through a private logistics firm. A black helicopter, no markings, prepped for offshore deck landing at a secondary airfield outside of Tampa. I sat at my desk until 3 in the morning reading Philip's report a 3rd time, marking nothing because there was nothing to mark. It was clean work. It said what it needed to say. Then I went to bed. I slept fine. The call came at 6:47 in the evening on the 2nd day. I was in the kitchen heating up leftovers when my phone lit up with Gloria's name. She never called during these things. Texts, maybe. A photo of a sunset with a caption about gratitude. But a voice call, that was different. I let it ring 3 times. Then I picked up. Hey. Her voice came through breezy, angled toward casual in the way people get when they're trying not to sound like they're trying. Just checking in. Everything all right out there? I kept my voice easy, the way you keep your hands relaxed when you're holding something fragile. Fine, yeah. It's been a lot. A pause. We did this whole group session on the upper deck this afternoon. Trust exercises. Todd cried, which I did not see coming. Sounds productive, I said. Another pause. Longer. I could hear wind in the background and the low thrum of the ship's engines somewhere beneath it. Ronald. Her voice dropped. Not dramatically, just enough. The breezy quality was gone. Something happened today. I set down my fork. What kind of something? A helicopter landed on the deck. She was speaking carefully now, each word placed. No markings. Nobody knew it was coming. The captain tried to radio them and got no response. A man got off, dark suit, briefcase, and he walked straight to Todd's lunch. Didn't ask directions. Didn't show credentials to anybody who could do anything about it. A breath. He asked for Todd by name. I said nothing. Ronald. Her voice dropped further, close to a whisper now. What did you do? The question sat between us on the line like something dropped on a hard floor. I'm not sure what you mean, I said. Don't. The single word landed flat and hard. Don't do that to me right now. Todd is locked in his cabin. Ryan won't answer his door. Half the ship thinks it's some kind of legal raid, and the other half is filming everything. I'm standing in a stairwell on deck 2, and I need you to tell me what is happening. I let the silence run for a few seconds, long enough for her to hear that I wasn't going to fill it on her schedule. You remember the consulting work I did a few years back? I said finally. The restructuring firm? Yes. Cautious now. You just met the new interim chairman. The line went so quiet I could hear the wind clearly. A door somewhere on the ship. The sea underneath, everything. That's no. Her voice strained against itself. That was a contract position. You said it was temporary. You said you weren't involved anymore. I said the contract was temporary. I replied. The equity wasn't. She exhaled. It was the sound of something giving way that had been holding for a long time. I didn't know it would go this far, she said, quieter now. And I could hear something in it that wasn't quite a defense. More like the first honest thing she'd said in months. Yes, you did, I answered. You just didn't think I'd be the one driving it. Silence. What happens when we dock? She asked finally. That depends, I said, on what you're willing to say when you do. She didn't answer. I could hear her breathing, shallow, controlled, the way she breathed when she was working very hard to keep something off her face. Tomorrow morning, she said at last. At least tell me what to expect. Wear something comfortable, I told her. It'll be a long day. I ended the call. Set the phone face down on the counter. The leftovers had gone cold. I put the plate in the refrigerator and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking at the dark yard. She'd finally asked the right question, just about 4 years too late. The freeze hit on a Thursday morning. I didn't make a production of it. I called my attorney, gave him 2 instructions, and let the paperwork do the rest. The joint checking account, the one Gloria used for household expenses, personal purchases, and, as I now knew, monthly transfers to Kyle, was frozen pending formal separation proceedings. The joint investment account followed an hour later. I left her personal credit card active. I wasn't trying to strand her. I was establishing a boundary that should have been established a long time ago. By noon, Kyle was calling. I let go to voicemail. He left 2 minutes and 40 seconds of controlled indignation, the kind that comes from a man who has never had to think carefully about where money comes from. He said I was being vindictive. He said Gloria had nothing to do with whatever corporate nonsense I was tangled up in. He said if I was going to punish her, I should at least be man enough to do it to her face instead of cutting off accounts while she was on a boat. I listened to it once, then set the phone down. Colin called that evening. His approach was different, quieter, more careful. He asked if I was okay first. Then he asked what was going on. I told him there were some financial irregularities I was dealing with, and that I'd explain more when I could. He didn't push. He just said, if you need anything, call me. For words that meant more than Kyle's entire voicemail. 2 days later, Kyle posted. I saw it because Colin forwarded it to me without comment. A Facebook post, long, formatted like a speech, the kind of thing someone drafts in their head for a while before they actually type it. Kyle called me a controlling narcissist. He said I had spent years using financial leverage to manage the people around me, and that this was just the latest iteration of a pattern he'd witnessed his whole life. He said his mother was an accomplished professional who had given everything to our family, and that I was trying to destroy her because my ego couldn't handle her success. The post ended with something about how real men support their partners instead of undermining them. It had 412 likes by the time I saw it. Several people I didn't know had left comments calling me names I won't repeat. One person wrote, "Your dad sounds like a real piece of work." Kyle had replied with a thumbs-up emoji. I read the post twice. Then I closed the browser and went back to the compliance documents I'd been reviewing. I did not respond. Not publicly, not privately, not a single word. That silence, as it turned out, was the thing that drove Kyle the most insane. He called twice more over the next 3 days. Both times I let it ring. He texted, "At least have the guts to defend yourself." Then, "Your silence proves everything I said." Then, at 11 at night, "I'm going to talk to someone at the Courier. People should know what kind of man you are." I read each message and put the phone back in my pocket. Colin, meanwhile, had been doing his own thinking. He called me on a Tuesday afternoon, and there was something different in his voice, a weight that hadn't been there before. "Dad," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me." "Go ahead." "Mom's been getting money from the joint account every month. A lot of it." "Was that? Did you know about that?" I told him I knew. He was quiet for a moment. "Kyle knew too, didn't he?" Colin said. It wasn't quite a question. "I don't know what Kyle knew," I said. "I know what the bank records show." Another pause. "Okay," he said finally, in the tone of a man recalibrating something. "Okay." We didn't say much after that, but something had shifted. I could hear it. The following Monday, Kyle called a reporter at the Columbus Courier. He pitched what he called an exclusive, a story about a retired CFO using corporate machinery as a personal weapon against his wife. The reporter, to his credit, started digging. Within 48 hours, the reporter had found the public compliance filings, the board resolution, and the audit summary that had been submitted to the state's Financial Oversight Office. He called Kyle back with a list of questions Kyle hadn't expected. The story that ran 3 days later was not the story Kyle had in mind. The ship came in 2 hours ahead of schedule. There was no announcement. No cheerful intercom voice thanking passengers for a weekend of transformational growth. Just the low groan of engines shifting to reverse and the thud of the hull settling against the pier like a man sitting down after a long argument. I wasn't at the dock. I didn't need to be. Walter Crane's team had coordinated with the Port Authority the previous evening. 3 independent auditors were on the pier before the gangway dropped, each carrying a tablet and a lanyard that identified them as representatives of Ashford Compliance Services. 2 attorneys stood behind them. A single photographer from the Financial Newswire service that had been anonymously tipped, not by me, by someone on Philip Okafor's team who understood that sunlight was its own form of enforcement, positioned himself near the terminal entrance. The leak had gone wider than the photographer, as leaks tend to do. Screenshots of the amended manifest, the flagged expense entries, and a redacted portion of the board resolution had circulated through 3 financial forums overnight. By the time the ship docked, the hashtag had already run its course and been replaced by actual news coverage. A regional business outlet had run a piece titled "Vantage Forward Chair Removed Mid-Cruise in Surprise Board Action." Todd Fielding's name was in the headline. Ryan Coulter's name was in the 4th paragraph. Gloria's name was in the 7th. I learned what happened on the pier from 2 sources: the attorney who was present, and Colin, who had driven down to Tampa on his own initiative without telling me or his brother. According to both accounts, Gloria came off the ship in oversized sunglasses and a gray sweatshirt that didn't belong to her. She was moving quickly, head down, one small bag in her hand. She made it approximately 30 feet before a reporter from the business outlet recognized her from the company's website and called out her name. She stopped. That was her first mistake. The second was turning around. The reporter asked 3 questions in rapid succession. Was she aware of the fraudulent billing entries at the time of the cruise? Did she consent to being listed as a contracted consultant? Could she explain the guest badge, access, timestamps, and restricted areas? Gloria said nothing. She turned back toward the terminal and kept walking. But the badge record, the expense filings, and the amended manifest were already in the public domain. Her silence wasn't protection. It was confirmation. Colin called me from the parking lot outside the terminal, voice tight. "Dad, it's bad. There are cameras." She looked. He stopped. She looked like she knew exactly what she was walking into. "Are you all right?" I asked. "I'm fine. I didn't know it would look like this." "Now you do," I said. Not harshly, just honestly. By the time Gloria got home that evening, HR had suspended her access credentials. Her company laptop had been flagged for collection. A formal letter from the Ashford legal team was already in transit, requesting that she preserve all communications related to the cruise planning and refrain from contacting any current Vantage Forward employees pending the investigation. She walked in through the back door and stood in the kitchen doorway, arms crossed over herself, face pale under the remains of a weekend tan. "They knew my name," she said. "The reporters, the auditors, everyone. Your name is in the filings," I said. I was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, a document open in front of me. I didn't stand up. I was just there, Ronald. I wasn't running anything. I looked up at her. You were listed as a consultant on a contract that doesn't exist, on a cruise funded through misappropriated company money, using credentials that were forged after the booking closed. Being present is the minimum requirement for culpability. You cleared that bar comfortably. Her jaw tightened. You could fix this. No, I said. I couldn't. And I wouldn't. She stared at me for a long moment. I watched her run through the options: anger, tears, negotiation, and come up empty on all three. What am I supposed to do? She asked finally. Get an attorney, I said. Not the company's. Your own. And answer the auditor's questions honestly, because the documents they already have are more detailed than anything you could spin. She left the kitchen without another word. I heard her go upstairs. I finished my coffee, closed the document, and texted Colin. How are you doing? He replied in 3 minutes. Okay. Thinking a lot. That's the right thing to be doing, I wrote back. He sent back a single word. Yeah. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, standard envelope, no special markings. Gloria picked it up from the mail herself. I was in the study when I heard her come in from the driveway, heard the rustle of envelopes, heard the particular silence that follows when someone reads something they weren't prepared for. She appeared in the doorway 2 minutes later holding the letter with both hands, the way people hold things they're afraid to put down. It was from the Ashford legal team. Formal, measured, for paragraphs. It informed her that as a named individual in the Vantage Forward Compliance Review, she was required to preserve all communications related to the cruise planning, refrain from contacting current company employees, and make herself available for a formal interview with the audit committee within 14 business days. One line near the bottom noted that any attempt to alter, delete, or obscure documentation would be treated as intentional obstruction and would nullify eligibility for severance or continued benefits. She read it standing in the doorway. Then she read it again. This is real, she said. Not a question. Yes, I said. They're going to pull my severance. That depends on what the audit finds and how you respond to it. Her jaw tightened. I need to call someone. You have relationships at Ashford. You can clarify that I wasn't the architect of any of this. You can tell them Ryan handled the logistics, and I was just what? I said. Just present. Just listed as a consultant on a contract that never existed. Just the person whose badge was scanned into restricted areas at 2:17 in the morning. She set the letter on the side table. You're enjoying this. I'm not, I said, and I meant it. There was nothing enjoyable about watching a 23-year marriage dissolve on a Tuesday afternoon in a room where we'd once shared a bottle of wine and argued about which couch to buy. I'm telling you the truth, which is more than you've done for me in a while. That landed. I watched it land, saw the slight flinch, the quick redirect of her eyes toward the window. I want to fix this, she said, quieter now. Some things don't fix, I said. They just resolve. She left the room. I heard her on the phone upstairs. Her attorney, I assumed. Good. That was the right move, even if it was a few days late. What I didn't know until Colin told me that evening was that Kyle had already made his call to the courier. Colin had heard about it from a mutual acquaintance. Apparently, Kyle had been talking about it openly, treating it like a strategy. The reporter's name was Dennis Albright, a mid-level business desk writer who covered regional corporate stories and the occasional human interest piece. Kyle had given him what he thought was a compelling narrative. Retired CFO weaponizes corporate acquisition to punish successful wife. Dennis Albright was thorough. Within 48 hours, he had pulled the public compliance filings, the board resolution, the state financial oversight submission, and a summary of the audit findings that had been made available through the standard public records process. He called Kyle back with a list of questions that included, were you aware your mother was listed as a consultant on a non-existent contract? Can you comment on the expense entries that bear her credentials? Is it true she consulted a divorce attorney 8 months before the cruise? Kyle apparently told Dennis he needed time to look into some things. The story that ran in the Courier 4 days later was titled, Vantage Forward Audit Exposes Cruise Fraud, Executive Removed, Several Staff Under Review. Gloria's name appeared in the 6th paragraph. The story was factual, measured, and thorough. It made no mention of a vindictive husband. It made extensive mention of falsified manifests, unauthorized expenditures, and credential misuse. Kyle called me the night the story ran. First time in 9 days. That wasn't what I intended, he said. I know, I replied. Dennis said he had documents I didn't know about. Most people who dig usually do, I said. A long pause. She's really in the filings. Yes. Another pause. Longer. You knew before she left on that cruise, didn't you? It wasn't quite an accusation. More like a man doing arithmetic out loud and arriving at an answer he didn't expect. I knew enough, I said. Kyle didn't respond to that. He stayed on the line for another minute without speaking, which for Kyle was extraordinary. He wasn't a man comfortable with silence. Then he said he had to go and hung up. He didn't apologize for the Facebook post. He didn't retract anything publicly. But the call stopped and the text stopped, and the next time I saw his name, it wasn't a message to Colin asking if the two of them could grab dinner. Small things, but they registered. Meanwhile, Todd Fielding had filed a civil suit against me personally. His attorney sent a letter claiming the board action constituted a hostile takeover executed in bad faith and in violation of shareholder agreements. The claim was creative. I'll give him that. His attorney had found a narrow argument around the timing of the Section G trigger relative to the beneficial owner notification window. I read the complaint on a Saturday morning with coffee. Then I sat down at my desk and spent 4 hours drafting a response brief myself. Not because I couldn't afford better, but because I knew the documents better than any attorney I could have hired. 22 pages, fully cited, with 3 exhibits. I sent it to my attorney with a note. Review and file, as is unless you find an error. He called me back in 2 hours. There are no errors, he said. This is the cleanest response brief I've read in a decade. The judge dismissed the suit 11 days later. 12 minutes of oral argument, then a flat denial. Todd Fielding left the courthouse in a dark sedan. No statement. No press conference. Just a man in expensive loafers who had finally run out of room to maneuver. Gloria came into the kitchen that evening while I was cooking. She stood at the counter for a moment without speaking. I heard about the lawsuit, she finally said. It's resolved, I told her. You wrote the brief yourself. I did. She was quiet for a moment. I forgot you could do that, she said. And there was something in her voice, not admiration, exactly, but a kind of recognition. Like she was seeing a version of me she'd filed away a long time ago and assumed had faded out. I didn't respond. I turned back to the stove. Some things you don't need to answer. The deposition was scheduled for a Thursday morning in a conference room downtown. Neutral ground, as these things go. A long table, 2 attorneys on each side, a court reporter in the corner, and the specific institutional chill that comes when every word is being permanently recorded. Gloria's attorney had requested that I appear for questioning related to the acquisition timeline and my role in the board action. My attorney had agreed, on the condition that the scope remain limited to documented corporate matters. Gloria's side had pushed back. We'd spent a week negotiating the parameters. None of that mattered once Gloria's attorney made his opening move. He asked me to describe, in detail, my awareness of Gloria's activities in the 12 months preceding the board action. Standard framing. I answered precisely, citing documents rather than impressions. Then he shifted, asked me whether I had used my position as a controlling shareholder to deliberately target my wife's employment as leverage in personal marital matters. I looked at him across the table. No, I said. The audit was initiated by documented financial irregularities. My personal relationship with one of the named individuals didn't influence the timeline or the findings. He pressed. I held. Then he played his card. He asked whether I would agree that Gloria had been a loyal and dedicated spouse who had, in his words, subordinated her professional ambitions to support my career during our marriage. My attorney objected to the framing. The objection was noted. I answered anyway. Gloria made professional choices that she found fulfilling, I said. I supported all of them. I paid for 2 graduate programs, underwrote her professional development account, and never once asked her to slow down. What I did not do was subordinate my judgment about financial misconduct because the person involved was someone I lived with. Gloria's attorney changed direction. The real blow came 3 days later. Not in the deposition room, but in the family court proceeding, where Gloria had requested an emergency hearing regarding temporary financial arrangements. Her attorney had filed a motion arguing that the account freeze had left her without adequate resources. The judge had agreed to hear it. Gloria's legal strategy included calling Kyle as a character witness. He showed up in a charcoal blazer, serious-faced, clearly coached. He testified that I had been emotionally withholding throughout his childhood, that I had used financial control as a substitute for genuine relationship, and that the current situation was consistent with a pattern of behavior he had observed his entire life. Gloria's attorney thanked him and sat down. My attorney stood up. He was a compact man named Gerald Finch, 61 years old, 35 years in family and corporate law, the kind of attorney who never raised his voice because he never needed to. He looked at Kyle for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Mr. Hargrove, are you aware that between 31 months ago and the present, your mother transferred approximately $135,000 from the joint marital account to accounts associated with your personal expenses?" Kyle's expression shifted. She helped me out sometimes, yes. $135,000, Gerald repeated. Documented. Monthly transfers, consistent amount, consistent destination. Were these transfers made with your father's knowledge? Kyle looked at Gloria's attorney. I assume. Were they made with your father's knowledge? Gerald asked again. I don't know, Kyle said finally. Thank you, Gerald said, and sat down. The room was quiet for a moment that stretched past comfortable. The judge made a note. Gloria's attorney studied his legal pad. Kyle sat in the witness chair looking like a man who had just understood, too late, that he'd walked into a different room than the one he thought he was entering. I didn't look at Gloria during any of this. I didn't need to. What I did notice was Colin, sitting 3 rows back in the gallery. He'd come without being asked, driven 4 hours to be present, and sat through the entire proceeding with his hands folded on his knees and his face set in that particular expression he'd had since he was 12, attentive, measuring, not yet ready to speak, but taking everything in. After the hearing, we stood in the courthouse parking lot. The afternoon was cold and bright, the kind of day that makes everything look clearer than it is. Dad, Colin said, I need to ask you something. Go ahead. Kyle didn't know about the transfers, did he? He just thought Mom was being generous. I looked at my younger son, 25 years old, more careful than his brother had ever been, and finally standing in the right place for the right reasons. I don't know what Kyle knew, I said. I know what he told himself. Colin nodded slowly. He looked at the courthouse for a moment, then back at me. She put him in a bad spot. She put a lot of people in bad spots, I said. Some of them knew it. Some of them didn't. We stood there for another minute without talking. The wind moved through the parking lot, scattering a few dead leaves across the asphalt. Then Colin said, I'm glad I came. I put a hand on his shoulder briefly. So am I said. That evening I got home and went to the garage. I've been holding something in for weeks, the kind of pressure that doesn't announce itself until it does. I picked up a ceramic pot that had been sitting on a shelf for 2 years, something Gloria had bought at market somewhere and never found a place for, and I threw it against the cinder block wall. It exploded on impact. Pieces scattered across the floor. I stood there breathing hard for about 30 seconds. Then I got a broom and cleaned it up. Some things you carry until you can't. Then you put them down hard, and you clean up the pieces, and you go back inside. Colin found them on a Saturday in October. He'd come over to help me move some furniture out of the spare bedroom. We were clearing it out as part of the general reorganization that follows when a household quietly becomes one person's instead of 2. Gloria had taken what she wanted in 2 trips and left the rest. Most of what remained was the accumulated residue of a long marriage. Boxes of things that had seemed important at some point and hadn't been looked at since. Colin was working his way through the closet shelf when he went quiet. Not the casual quiet of someone focused on a task. A different kind, the kind that has weight behind it. Dad, he said. I turned from the box I was sorting. He was holding a bundle of envelopes. Not official mail. Personal, handwritten, bound with a rubber band that had dried and cracked with age. He handed them to me without another word. I counted 11. The return address on each was Ryan Coulter's home address in Westerville. Not the Vantage Forward office, his personal address. They were dated across a span of 7 years. The oldest was from the spring of the year Kyle graduated high school. The most recent was 14 months ago. I sat down on the edge of the bed and read 2 of them. That was enough. They were not professional communications. They were not ambiguous. 7 years. The cruise had not been the beginning of anything. It had been a continuation of something that had been running quietly beneath the surface of our marriage for longer than I'd had any reason to suspect. I put the letters back in the envelopes, set the bundle on the nightstand, sat there for a moment with my hands on my knees. Colin was standing in the closet doorway, not speaking, giving me the room to process without being crowded. He was good at that, had been since he was a teenager. He always knew when to stay close and when to give space. 7 years, I said finally. Not to him, really. Just out loud. I'm sorry, Dad, he said quietly. Don't be sorry, I told him. You didn't do anything. I picked up the bundle and carried it to my study, where I photographed each letter and forwarded them to Gerald Finch with a brief note. The originals went into the document safe. They weren't going to change the outcome of anything that was already in motion. The divorce proceedings were past the point where this would shift the financial picture significantly. But they were documentation. And I had learned, over a long career, that documentation always mattered eventually. That evening I drove to a diner 12 miles from the house and sat in a corner booth with coffee and eggs I didn't particularly want. My phone showed a missed call from Kyle, the third that week. I called him back. He picked up on the second ring. I've been trying to reach you, he said. I know. I'm returning it now. A pause. I heard about the hearing, about what came out with the transfers. His voice had lost the combative edge it had carried for weeks. What was left sounded like a man working through something uncomfortable. I didn't know she was pulling from a joint account. I know, I said. She'd send money and say she was helping out. I assumed it was from her own. He stopped. I didn't ask. No, I said. You didn't. Silence on the line. Then, I said some things publicly that weren't fair. Yes, I said. You did. I'm not going to take the post down, he said, and I could hear him steeling himself for the pushback. But I want you to know I understand now that I didn't have the full picture. I considered that for a moment. It wasn't an apology. Kyle wasn't built for apologies. He was built for partial concessions delivered in a way that preserved his self-image. But it was something. It was him arriving at the edge of accountability on his own feet, which with Kyle counted for more than a rehearsed speech would have. All right, I said. All right. He sounded almost surprised. We can talk more when you're ready, I said. There's no deadline on it. He was quiet again. Then, Colin told me about what he found today. The letters. Yes. How long? 7 years, I said. Another long silence. I'm sorry, Dad. And this time it sounded like he meant it. Not tactically, not as a way to close a topic, but the way a person sounds when they finally stood in the right place and looked in the right direction. I know, I said. We talked for another 20 minutes. Not about Gloria, not about the legal proceedings, just talked, the way we used to when he was younger and hadn't yet figured out that he could use words as weapons. It wasn't a full repair, but it was a door opening. I take it. I drove home in the dark and went to bed without checking my email. Some days you just let the day be over. The quarterly shareholder meeting of Vantage Forward, now operating under Walter Crane's interim leadership, was held on a Thursday morning in a conference room on the 14th floor of an office building in downtown Columbus. I had not attended the previous 2 board sessions. This one I attended in person. The room filled quietly. Attorneys, minority shareholders, 2 journalists who had been granted access for the first time since the audit became public, a handful of the company's senior staff who had survived the restructuring and were trying to read the temperature of the new administration. Walter ran the opening segment efficiently. Audit status, operational restructuring, revised financial projections. No theatrics. No hashtags. Then came the restructuring vote. The agenda item was labeled Executive Equity Realignment, a dry phrase for what it actually was: the formal liquidation of stock options and deferred compensation held by the 5 individuals named in the compliance findings. Todd Fielding, Ryan Coulter, 3 supporting executives who had facilitated various elements of the scheme, and Gloria. She was in the room, 3rd row, on the aisle, beside her attorney. She'd known about the agenda item for 5 days. Her attorney had received the notice, and she had filed an objection through proper channels arguing that her inclusion among the named individuals was disproportionate to her documented involvement. The objection had been reviewed and denied. I walked to the front of the room when Walter nodded to me. I didn't use notes. 11 months ago, I said, this company was being run by people who believed that rules were for the benefit of other people. They spent company money like it was a personal entertainment budget. They falsified documents. They reclassified guests as consultants to avoid scrutiny. And when it was convenient, they used the credentials of people close to them to put distance between themselves and their own decisions. I looked at the room, not at Gloria specifically, at the room. I built the structure that caught this. I'm not here to take credit for that. It's just how sound corporate governance works when someone actually bothers to implement it. What I am here to do is confirm the final step. I turn to the screen behind me. A single slide. Confirm equity liquidation. 5 names. This isn't about personal grievances, I said. It's about accountability. The same accountability this company should have had built into its foundation from the beginning. I click confirm. The legal officer across the table nodded. The motion carried. Gloria's attorney made a note without looking up. Gloria herself sat very still, her hands folded on the table in front of her, looking at neither me nor the screen. The meeting continued for another 40 minutes. I sat through it, answered 2 questions from minor shareholders about the restructuring timeline, and left when it adjourned. In the elevator, Walter stood beside me. Clean, he said. That's the goal, I replied. Outside, the November air was cold and direct, the way Ohio gets when autumn gives up and winter stops pretending. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked up at the building, 14 floors of glass and steel, humming with whatever it was doing now, but the people running it were different people. My phone buzzed. Colin, how'd it go? I typed back, done. All of it. 3 dots appeared, then, good. Dinner Sunday. Yes, I wrote. I put the phone in my coat pocket and started toward the parking garage. Behind me, the building kept going. Meetings in rooms, decisions being made, ordinary Tuesday business happening in the new ordinary. 2 weeks later, the divorce was finalized. Gloria received a settlement that reflected what the law required and nothing beyond it. The house sold 4 months after that. I moved into a smaller place on the east side of Columbus, a 2-bedroom with a study, a decent kitchen, and a back porch that faced a stand of oak trees that would be worth looking at come spring. Ryan Coulter settled the civil component of the compliance findings for a sum I won't disclose. His professional career in Columbus was finished. Todd Fielding's leadership agency filed for Chapter 7 liquidation 8 months after his removal. The brand he'd built on borrowed credibility and misappropriated funds turned out to have no foundation without either. Kyle and I had dinner in December. Just the 2 of us, a steakhouse near his place. He didn't bring up the Facebook post, and neither did I. We talked about his job, a woman he'd been seeing, whether he wanted to go somewhere warm for the holidays. It wasn't what we'd had before, but it was real, which was more than what we'd had in the last years of the marriage. Colin came to the new place the first weekend I was settled. He brought a bottle of something decent, and we sat on the back porch until the temperature made it impractical. He asked me once, near the end of the evening, whether I was all right. Better than I've been in years, I told him, and meant it. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. Then he poured the last of the bottle, and we watched the oak trees lose the last of their light.